Because, as you know, kernel is just a set of different configurations inside the MC. You just create a kernel bus, which is much lighter, meaning it's not lifecycle aware. You can have bin validator, which is not as dynamic as it is currently. Or you can use, there's a notion of graph controller, meaning the controller itself is a planar graph, and you can have at search, meaning you can check different, you can specify a search strategy or inject lookup strategy based on the at search. And at JMX and at JNDI, those are just annotations, and everything else is an implementation detail. How you implement the behavior behind those annotations is up to you. We provide a couple of defaults, but everything else is up to you. The class loading itself, the new layer, the MC class loading layer, is completely all class metadata driven. How you provide that class loading data, it's up to you. You can do it programmatically, you can do it by parsing the JBoss class loading XML and so on. We encourage the usage of JBoss class loading XML. It's sort of a notion of, ORG notion of how you describe your imports or your exports. And what it does, it creates proper dependencies between deployments. For example, when currently with JBoss, there's all like big ball of mud. All the class loading is flat, so everybody sees everybody. But with this, you can just create proper class dependencies. What you can also do is just create a class loader per bean, a class loader per the whole deployment. That's the class loader element. And a proper usage of, like the nice usage of class loading, what you can actually do more, which you're not able to do on a class loader class. You can use the module, which holds the whole information about your deployment's class loading rules. For example, all the exports, all the imports, all the filters and so on. And it has a nice rich API based on the visitor pattern again. So you can do all the nice things. For example, you can do regular expression matching of the resources and so on. The new feature that we added was a translator per policy. So it means, for example, if you're using sort of a Spring low-time weaving, instead of weaving the whole domain, you can just add the translator per the policy. The last thing that I want to mention is the deployers, tips and tricks. There's a bunch of useful helper and abstract deployers. You just need to find the right one, pick the right one, and probably the rest is just going to be a few lines of code to add your custom deployer. Sort of to limit the scanning because to the whole deployment lifecycle, we do scanning for annotations, which we provide information to EJB layer, SIEM layer, JPA, and so on. If you wanted to limit what you scan, there's a JBoss scanning XML, which somehow limits what you actually scan. And the thing is, like, since even the whole deployment and all the beans inside are run by the same state machine, the deployment itself is a component inside MC, and all the beans, and of course services and beans and so on, are components as well. What you can do is you can just mix and match. You can create a dependency on a deployment, from a bean to the deployment, from deployment to a bean, and so on, or deployment to a deployment. And this is what you can use. It's just a generic mechanism of expressing your dependencies to the JBoss minus dependency XML. What you're going to do is, since you're already all these different components inside AS, for example, JPA, which is Hibernate, or SIEM, or WebBeans, they all need to do sort of a lookup for resources. And in order to not do scanning like 3-4 times, we're just going to do the scanning once and federate some of the work to the proper implementation. There's a JPA federation resource implementation, SIEM, and so on. So it means like all the scanning is just going to be done once. There's an interesting feature that we have. It's called integration deployers, which means you can instead of having a user add certain jars to the class path, you can add them dynamically. This is what we do with SIEM or with WebBeans. We look up the deployment, recognize it as a team deployment, and we add certain SIEM JBoss AS integration classes into the class path. That's the same way how JSF unit works. Also recognizes JSF applications and adds it to the deployment units. There's a nice feature. What we do with deployment is we recognize the structure and then we do real deployment. And just in between, you can add an additional structure processor, which on a given structured information adds additional information. For example, what we do with SIEM is there was a feature request that SIEM wanted to have each SIEM application should be temped, meaning because it means it had to create a temporary copy because at undeploy, some of the SIEM applications still do some resources lookup. And of course, if you deleted the original, there will be no place to actually do the resources lookup. So we do a temporary copy. And you can already do temporary copy by specifying a JBoss structure XML file. But to have it done this through the API or in a generic way, there's a thing called structure processor. It's part of the deployers XML. You can see there's a default implementation. Currently, there's one implementation, and it's the SIEM implementation that recognizes each SIEM deployment and adds it, and marks it as it should be temped. The way how we recognize if any of the files was modified, there's a thing called structure modification checker. By default, what we currently do is we recognize the metadata locations and check all the XML files inside if any of them change. But in order for, you can, for example, Bob McWhirter's TorqueBox uses a different set of configuration files because of the Rails. He can add his own structure modification checker based on the Rails files, not just XMLs, but Rails files. Currently, I think each deployment and each sub-deployment is registered against JMX, and that's optional. It's easily turned off, so it means you gain some performance, but for production that's useful. But for deployment, you can check. You're still able to go to the JMX console and see all the deployments to the JMX layer. Of course, you can also turn on statistics, meaning you can check which deployer actually was used and what kind of attachments or kind of metadata it produced. There's a thing called class loader factory, which is eventually what creates the class loader at the end, and it's useful for if you do an external class loader usage. For example, if you delegate some of the work, you have an embedded OSGI framework, and you want to delegate the class loading, setting the class loader to the deployment unit based on the OSGI frameworks bundle. Just a thing called class loader factory, which does that for you. So, how much of this we use in AS5? I think apart from Java CIS-based reflect, everything else is already used in AS5, JBoss 5. The federation thing, the subdimension, how to federate resources lookups, it's still a work in progress, but eventually it's going to optimize AS boot time significantly. We can always discuss some of these features on the MC's user forum, developers forum. If you know any other optimization, if you use any other optimization, if you want any other optimization, just feel free and just ping me on the forums. Okay.